It was a Sunday morning in May, and the air in Willow Creek carried the soft smell of blooming dogwood trees. Bells rang from the steeple of St. Matthew's, the town's oldest church, summoning its congregation as they had for more than a century. Families in pressed suits and pastel dresses made their way through the tall wooden doors, exchanging polite greetings as sunlight spilled over the manicured lawns. For many, it was an ordinary Sunday. For Clara Jenkins, it was anything but. Clara, a 28-year-old schoolteacher, walked up the stone steps of the church with her Bible tucked neatly under her arm. Her heart raced, not from nerves, but from excitement. She had been raised in faith, her grandmother teaching her to pray before she could read. After months of searching for a new place of worship closer to her teaching job, Clara thought she had finally found it here in Willow Creek. St. Matthew's had seemed warm and inviting from the outside, a place where she could anchor herself in both faith and community. But there was something Clara hadn't considered: her race. Willow Creek was a town that prided itself on tradition, but many of those traditions were steeped in exclusion. Clara, a black woman in a mostly white town, had already endured sideways glances at the grocery store and whispered judgments at the library where she volunteered. Still, she believed the church would be different. After all, wasn't faith supposed to unite rather than divide? As she reached for the polished brass handle of the church door, a figure blocked her way. It was Elder Thomas Whitaker, a man with silver hair, a stiff suit, and a reputation for enforcing the unspoken rules of St. Matthew's. His smile was tight, almost rehearsed. "Can I help you, young lady?" he asked, his voice cordial but laced with an unmistakable edge. Clara's own smile was warm. "Good morning, sir. I'm here for the service." But Whitaker's hand didn't move from the door. His eyes flicked over her, assessing, calculating, as though weighing something heavier than her simple request. He cleared his throat before speaking again. "I'm afraid this congregation has certain traditions," he said slowly. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable worshiping with your own community." The words hit Clara like a slap. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice catching. Whitaker leaned closer, lowering his tone so that the families walking past wouldn't hear. "This church has never been a place for mixing. It's not personal, you understand. It's just the way things are here." Clara froze. Around her, parents guided children through the open doors, their Sunday, shoes clicking on the polished floors. None seemed to notice the standoff happening at the entrance. Or maybe they did, and chose silence. Her throat tightened as shame, anger, and disbelief surged through her at once. Was she really being told she wasn't welcome in God's house because of the color of her skin? "I came here to worship," Clara said, her voice trembling but resolute. "That's all." But Whitaker's expression hardened. "Not here, you won't." And with that, he pulled the door closed in her face. The bells continued to chime overhead, their melody ringing hollow in the silence that followed. Clara stood frozen on the steps, her Bible pressed against her chest, her reflection staring back at her in the glossy wooden door that had been slammed shut. In that moment, she felt the weight of centuries of exclusion pressing down on her shoulders. Yet, beneath the sting of humiliation, something else began to rise, a quiet fire. She would not let this be the end of her story. For though the church doors were barred to her, Clara's faith was unshakable. And what she chose to do next would not only expose the hypocrisy within St. Matthew's, but would ripple through the entire town, leaving scars and lessons that no one would ever forget. To understand Clara Jenkins, one had to understand where she came from. She wasn't just a woman who showed up at St. Matthew's one morning and faced rejection. She was the product of a life molded by resilience, quiet faith, and unyielding dignity. Clara had grown up in a small town 2 hours south of Willow Creek, raised primarily by her grandmother, Evelyn Jenkins. Evelyn was a woman of deep conviction, the type who believed that God's promises were not to be doubted, even in the hardest of times. She often said, "Faith isn't tested when life is easy, Clara. It's tested when the world tells you you're not enough." Those words would echo in Clara's mind years later as she stood on those church steps, denied the right to worship. Her mother, Rosa, had worked 2 jobs most of Clara's childhood. One as a waitress in a roadside diner, the other cleaning offices after hours. Her father had left when she was still a baby, so Clara rarely thought of him except in fleeting questions. Was he tall like me? Did he care that I existed? But Evelyn and Rosa had filled that void with an abundance of love and faith, ensuring Clara grew up with a sense of belonging even when the world tried to make her feel otherwise. At school, Clara had been one of the few black students in a mostly white district. She had learned early on what it meant to be different. There were the subtle slights. The way teachers assumed she was less capable until she proved herself. The way children whispered about her hair or skin during recess. And then there were the more overt acts. A vandalized locker, a cruel note slipped in her textbook, a coach who overlooked her despite her obvious talent. Through it all, Clara carried herself with quiet grace. She refused to be defined by others' prejudice. Faith became her anchor. While other teens spent weekends at malls or parties, Clara often spent hers at church, singing in the choir, helping with food drives, tutoring younger kids in Sunday school. She loved the way the sanctuary smelled of polished wood and hymnals, the way the stained glass windows painted her skin in hues of crimson and gold. Church was where she felt closest to God, but also where she felt seen, valued, and whole. That sense of belonging carried her into adulthood. Clara pursued teaching, driven by the belief that education was both a weapon and a gift. She moved to Willow Creek after landing a job at the town's middle school, teaching literature to 7th graders. Her classroom quickly became a refuge for students who felt out of place, who needed someone to believe in them. She decorated the walls with quotes from poets and writers, Langston Hughes, Maya Angelou, Walt Whitman, and reminded her students daily that their voices mattered. Still, Willow Creek was not always kind. The town was polite on the surface, but Clara felt the undercurrents of suspicion. Parents sometimes questioned her methods. Neighbors rarely invited her to community events, and she often noticed how her presence shifted the air in rooms. Yet she clung to faith, believing that if she kept giving kindness, the world would eventually soften. That's why she had gone to St. Matthew's. She longed for more than just a personal relationship with God. She wanted community. She wanted to sit in the pews on Sundays, to join a Bible study, to lift her voice with others in hymns. Most importantly, she wanted to show her students that faith wasn't confined by race or place. If she could find a home in Willow Creek's oldest church, perhaps it would signal progress for the whole town. But what happened at those doors proved otherwise. In the days that followed, Clara found herself replaying the scene in her mind. Elder Whitaker's cold stare, the murmurs of families slipping past, the heavy thud of the door shutting her out. At first, the memory filled her with shame. Had she been foolish to expect acceptance? But then, Evelyn's voice rose in her memory again. Faith is tested when the world tells you you're not enough. Clara began to realize that what had happened wasn't just about her. It was about something much larger. The hypocrisy of a community that preached love while practicing exclusion, the generations of silent complicity that allowed prejudice to flourish in spaces meant for worship. And though the door had been slammed shut, Clara knew she could not simply walk away. She wasn't just a victim, she was a witness. And perhaps, she thought, God had placed her in Willow Creek for a reason far greater than her own comfort. What she chose to do next would test not only her own courage, but also the very foundations of Willow Creek's faith community. The Sunday Clara Jenkins was turned away from St. Matthew's. She walked home with her Bible clutched against her chest, her heart heavy. The sting of rejection lingered, not just in the sharp words of Elder Whitaker, but in the quiet complicity of everyone who had seen and said nothing. Yet Clara's sorrow quickly transformed into determination. She knew this moment was not hers to carry alone. The following day, she confided in a trusted colleague, Mrs. Alvarez, another teacher at Willow Creek Middle School. Mrs. Alvarez listened, her face hardening with each detail Clara shared. "This isn't right, Clara. You can't stay silent. This isn't just about you. It's about every child who will grow up thinking this is normal." That struck a chord. Clara had always believed in the power of education, of shaping young minds not just with books, but with examples. Remaining silent would mean teaching her students that injustice was to be endured, not challenged. And so, she began to act. First, she documented everything, what was said, who was there, even the time of day, and what hymn the choir was singing as she stood outside. She contacted the regional office of the denomination, filing a formal complaint against St. Matthew's leadership. To her surprise, her letter received little more than a curt acknowledgement. "We will review the matter in due course," they wrote. Days passed, then weeks, and nothing happened. Frustrated but undeterred, Clara turned to the local press. A young journalist named Anthony Rowe, eager to prove himself, agreed to meet her. Clara told him everything: the history of St. Matthew's, the community's unspoken prejudices, the rejection she faced at the church's door. Anthony was struck not only by her story, but by her courage to speak it aloud. Within a week, the Willow Creek Gazette ran a front-page article. "Teacher denied entry to church because of race." The town erupted. Some praised Clara's bravery. Others dismissed her as a troublemaker stirring division. Letters poured into the newspaper. One read, "It's about time someone exposed the hypocrisy in this town." Another sneered, "If she doesn't like it here, she should go back where she came from." Clara's students whispered in the hallways. Some hugged her, proud that their teacher was standing up for herself. Others avoided her, fearful their parents' disapproval would spill over. Willow Creek, once known for its calm predictability, was suddenly a battleground of values. Then came the twist. A few days after the article, Clara received an envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a handwritten letter signed "Only a Friend Within." The note revealed that St. Matthew's leadership had a history of quietly barring people of color. Elder Whitaker was not acting alone. The church council had agreed, years ago, to preserve tradition by maintaining what they called an unspoken membership standard. The letter even hinted at financial corruption, church funds being misused by leaders who presented themselves as paragons of morality. For Clara, the letter was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it confirmed what she feared, that St. Matthew's rejection of her was not an isolated incident, but an ingrained practice. Liberating because it gave her a path forward. She now had the leverage to show that her experience was part of a much deeper rot. Anthony, the journalist, jumped at the chance to investigate further. Together, he and Clara began gathering testimonies. A retired black janitor, who once worked at the church, admitted he had been forced out after 2 decades of service because his presence unsettled the congregation. A biracial couple recalled how they had been turned away from baptizing their child at St. Matthew's years earlier. And buried in the county archives, Anthony discovered a decades-old lawsuit that had mysteriously vanished from public memory, an attempt by a family to sue the church for discrimination, quietly dismissed by a sympathetic judge. As the evidence mounted, Clara realized this was bigger than just St. Matthew's. It was about the moral authority of institutions that claimed to represent God, but weaponized faith to exclude. The deeper she dug, the clearer it became. Silence was the soil where injustice thrived. The town's atmosphere grew tense. St. Matthew's leaders denied everything, accusing Clara of slander. Some of her neighbors stopped greeting her. She found anonymous notes on her car. "Leave well enough alone." But alongside the hostility came support. Families who had long stayed quiet began to speak out, emboldened by Clara's courage. Small prayer groups gathered in living rooms, worshiping freely outside the shadow of St. Matthew's doors. For Clara, the turning point wasn't just the discovery of corruption within the church. It was seeing the cracks form in Willow Creek's carefully polished surface. People who had lived side by side for years were now asking questions they'd never dared ask before. What does faith mean if it excludes? Who are we if we allow this? As she prepared for the next step, sharing her findings publicly, Clara felt both the weight and the hope of her actions. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. But one thing was clear: the door that had been slammed in her face had opened another, one that led not to a single church, but to a reckoning for the entire town. By the time Clara Jenkins and Anthony Rowe compiled their evidence, The atmosphere in Willow Creek felt like a simmering kettle, just waiting to boil over. The whispers had grown into open debates at grocery store lines, on porches, and in coffee shops. The once polite silence around St. Matthew's had cracked wide open, exposing the raw nerve beneath. Anthony decided to publish a follow-up story. This time, not just about Clara's rejection, but about the systematic discrimination that stretched back decades. His headline read, "St. Matthew's History of Exclusion and Corruption Uncovered." The piece laid out the testimonies Clara had helped collect. The janitor who was forced out, the couple denied their child's baptism, and even archived records showing repeated complaints filed against the church. But the most shocking detail was the financial scandal. Anthony's research uncovered that church funds, meant for charity and community programs, had been diverted into personal accounts belonging to Elder Whitaker and 2 other council members. Tens of thousands of dollars had quietly disappeared under the guise of maintenance projects and mission donations. When the article hit the stands, Willow Creek erupted. It wasn't just about race anymore. It was about hypocrisy, greed, and betrayal at the heart of an institution people trusted. The very leaders who had stood in the pulpit preaching about morality had been using their positions to line their pockets and guard their own power. On that Sunday, the pews of St. Matthew's were full, but the air was different. People weren't there to worship. They were there to see what would happen. Elder Whitaker stood at the pulpit, his voice trembling as he denied the allegations. He called the reports lies spun by an angry woman with an agenda, and he accused Anthony of slander. But his words lacked the force they once carried. Murmurs of doubt filled the sanctuary, and eyes that once looked at him with reverence now regarded him with suspicion. Then came the moment that would change everything. Clara herself walked into St. Matthew's, not through the back door or quietly slipping into the crowd, but down the center aisle, her Bible in hand. The congregation fell silent, all eyes fixed on her. She walked with calm dignity, her every step a statement louder than any words. When she reached the front, she didn't lash out or shout. Instead, she opened her Bible and read aloud. "There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." Her voice was steady, strong, carrying across the hushed room. She then looked directly at Whitaker and the council. "If this house is truly God's, then his word should be enough to welcome me, to welcome all of us. But if this house is yours, then let it stand on your name, not his." A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Some people stood in support, others remained frozen, but the line had been drawn. Clara closed her Bible, turned, and walked back down the aisle, each step echoing against the floorboards. But this time, she wasn't walking out in shame. She was walking out in defiance, leaving the weight of truth behind her. That night, video clips of Clara's reading circulated on social media. Anthony had recorded it and uploaded it, and within hours it spread beyond Willow Creek. Hashtags like hashtag Open the Doors and hashtag Faith for All began trending locally. Other towns began sharing their own stories of exclusion, inspired by Clara's courage. Whitaker and his allies tried to fight back, calling emergency meetings and threatening lawsuits. But the evidence was too overwhelming. The bank records, the testimonies, the hidden history, they couldn't silence it all. By midweek, the regional church office, which had once brushed off Clara's complaint, was forced to act. An investigation was officially launched, and for the first time in decades, St. Matthew's Council faced the possibility of being removed. For Clara, the twist wasn't just that she had uncovered corruption or that the leaders were finally under scrutiny. It was watching the town itself begin to change. Families who had once turned away from hard conversations were now asking themselves what kind of church and what kind of community they wanted to be part of. But with the change came risk. Clara received threatening phone calls late at night. Anonymous letters slipped under her door warned her to stop tearing apart the church and know her place. Some neighbors she'd once shared meals with no longer spoke to her. Yet, just as many others rallied around her. Her classroom was filled with flowers, notes of encouragement from parents and students alike. One read, Thank you for showing us what faith looks like in action. The cracks in St. Matthew's foundation were now undeniable. Clara had forced the truth into the open, but as she prepared for the days ahead, she knew this was only the beginning. The town would have to decide whether to cling to the safety of silence or embrace the hard, painful work of transformation. In the weeks following Clara Jenkins' bold stand at St. Matthew's, Willow Creek was a town transformed. What had once been a quiet, tightly woven community suddenly felt raw and exposed, every whispered truth brought to the surface. The events of that Sunday had unsettled not just the pews of one church, but the conscience of an entire town. The official investigation into St. Matthew's leadership moved slowly, as such things often do, but the damage to the church's reputation was immediate. Families who had once filled its pews began leaving in droves, some quietly slipping into smaller churches, others forming home-based prayer groups where everyone was welcome. Attendance at St. Matthew's plummeted. Elder Whitaker tried desperately to hold on to power, but his words no longer carried authority. In one tense council meeting, a longtime member stood and said, "We trusted you to lead us, but you've led us astray." It was the first time anyone inside the church had spoken against him openly, and it marked the beginning of his downfall. Soon after, 2 other council members resigned under the weight of scandal, and Whitaker himself was suspended pending the results of the financial inquiry. But for Clara, the true impact wasn't in the leadership's fall. It was in the faces of her neighbors, the way people who had once looked through her now looked at her. Parents stopped her in the school hallway to say thank you. Former students wrote her letters, telling her how proud they were to see someone stand up for what was right. Even those who didn't fully agree with her admitted that her courage had forced them to confront truths they'd long ignored. Yet the support wasn't universal. A portion of Willow Creek still clung to the old ways. Some accused Clara of dividing the community or disrespecting the church. Her house was egged one night, her tires slashed another. She reported these incidents, but the police, many of whom attended St. Matthew's, were slow to respond. Still, Clara refused to let fear silence her. The defining moment came 3 months later when the regional church office held an open forum in Willow Creek. Hundreds of people gathered in the high school gymnasium, the tension palpable. Leaders from across the state listened as testimonies were read, stories of exclusion, of hypocrisy, of lives hurt by the policies of St. Matthew's. And then Clara was invited to speak. She walked to the podium, her steps measured, her heart steady. For a moment, she simply looked out at the crowd, the neighbors she had taught, the children she had watched grow, the leaders who had tried to silence her. And then she spoke. Faith is not found in shutting people out. It's found in opening doors, even when it's uncomfortable. What happened to me at St. Matthew's was not about one Sunday or one person. It was about a culture that confused tradition with truth. If a church becomes a place of exclusion, then it ceases to be a house of God. I did not come here today to tear down. I came here to remind us that we are capable of better. Her words hung in the air long after she stepped down. Some people wept openly. Others sat in silence, wrestling with the weight of what they'd heard. In the months that followed, the regional office officially dissolved St. Matthew's Council and replaced it with interim leaders. The church doors remained open, but the congregation was forever changed. Some never returned. Others saw the scandal as a chance to rebuild, to finally live up to the values they claimed to hold. As for Clara, she continued teaching, her life quieter but undeniably altered. She received invitations to speak in nearby towns, to share her story of courage and conviction. Though she remained humble, she understood the importance of her role. "I didn't want this fight," she told Anthony once in an interview. "But sometimes the fight chooses you." Looking back, the memory of that Sunday lingered like a shadow across Willow Creek. People remembered the hush that fell as Clara read from her Bible, the simple but profound words that cut deeper than any accusation. "You are all one in Christ Jesus." For some, it haunted them as a reminder of their silence. For others, it inspired them as a call to action. Years later, when children asked their parents why the old church on Main Street had nearly collapsed, the story would be told. They would hear about the woman who refused to be barred from worship, the woman who turned rejection into revelation. And they would hear about the day Willow Creek was forced to choose between comfort and conviction. The truth is, Clara never set out to haunt anyone. She set out to live her faith. But in doing so, she left behind a legacy that would echo far longer than the anger of her detractors or the fear of her enemies. Because sometimes, the most haunting thing is not the injustice itself, but the courage of the one who stands against it.